There is a photograph taken at the White House in 1969. Bob Hope is standing next to Richard Nixon. Both men are smiling. Both men look entirely at ease. Nixon has his hand on Hope's shoulder in the way that powerful men touch people they consider useful. And Hope is grinning. The grin that 60 years of performing had made automatic. The grin that said everything was fine, everything was funny, everything was exactly as it appeared to be. 4 months later, Bob Hope stood on a stage in Vietnam and told the soldiers that Nixon had a solid plan for ending the war. The soldiers booed, not politely, not with the restrained displeasure of men who disagreed with a political position. They booed the way men boo when they are tired and afraid and feel that someone in a position of safety and comfort has just said something to their faces that they know is not true. They were the men doing the dying. Nixon was in the White House, and Bob Hope, the man who had come to their jungle to make them laugh, was reading them a line from the president's office as if it were a punchline. It was not a punchline. Nothing about it was funny. That night in Vietnam in 1969 is the moment that many people point to as the beginning of the end of something for Bob Hope. Not his career, which continued for another 2 decades. Not his marriage, which continued for 34 more years until his death in 2003. Something else. The gap between the image and the reality, which had always existed in Bob Hope's life, suddenly became visible in a way that could not be easily hidden. The most beloved entertainer in America, the man who had flown into war zones for 25 years to bring laughter to the men who were fighting, was standing in a war zone reading government talking points to men who knew they were dying for a lie. He was 66 years old. He had been performing for 50 years, and for the first time in his professional life, the audience was not laughing. This is the story of what was behind the jokes, not just the politics. The marriage he may never have legally had. The first wife America never knew existed. The affairs with dozens of women that his staff was hired to conceal. The father who drank and disappeared. The childhood that left a mark he spent his whole life performing over. And the man that Dolores Hope lived with for 69 years, mostly alone in a house in Toluca Lake, while her husband was somewhere else, with someone else, laughing the laugh that everyone in America thought they knew. It was a very good laugh. It was not the whole story. His name at birth was Leslie Towns Hope. He was born on the 29th of May, 1903 in Eltham, a suburb of London, England, the 5th of 7 sons born to William Henry Hope and Avis Towns Hope. His father was a stonemason. His mother had been a concert singer in Wales before she married. The family was not poor in the way that means desperate, but they were not comfortable either. And the particular anxiety of a household that is always slightly short of what it needs was the air that Leslie Hope breathed from the beginning. His father drank. This is something that the biographies mention and then move past, but it deserves more than a mention because the drinking father is the fact underneath several of the other facts in this story. William Hope was not a reliable presence in the household. He was there and then he was not there, in the way that men with a serious relationship to alcohol are sometimes there and sometimes not, and the not there times were unpredictable. And the effect on 7 boys growing up in a house like that was the effect it always is. A particular vigilance, a need to read the room, to understand quickly what kind of mood the room is in, and to adjust accordingly. Leslie Hope adjusted by performing. He was, by every account, a mimic almost from the time he could speak. He could imitate anyone he heard. He won a Charlie Chaplin imitation contest at the age of 10, which is perhaps the earliest external confirmation of something that everyone around him had already understood. The boy was funny, and the boy knew how to make a room feel different from whatever it had been feeling before he started talking. In 1908, when Leslie was 4 years old, the family emigrated to the United States. They came through Ellis Island in March of that year, packed into 3rd class on the steamship Philadelphia, and settled in Cleveland, Ohio, where his father's brothers were already working. The Cleveland they arrived in was not an easy place for a British child. The accent was wrong. The references were wrong. The neighborhood kids, with the specific cruelty of children who sense foreignness, turned his last name into the nickname Hopelessly. When he shortened his first name to Les, they called him Hopeless. He learned to fight. He was good at it. He boxed as a teenager with enough skill that he considered briefly a professional career in the ring. He sold newspapers on the streets of Cleveland to help the family. He worked whatever jobs came available. And he performed constantly for anyone who would watch, because performing was the thing that worked. When he was performing, the room changed. The people in it laughed. And when the people in the room were laughing, the particular anxiety of a boy from a house with an absent father and a family, always slightly short of what it needed, was, for the duration of the laughter, gone. He never stopped needing the laughter. That is the most important thing to understand about everything that followed. He was 22 years old when he got his first real break in vaudeville, performing in a double act with a woman named Grace Troxell. She was a dancer and singer. He was the comic. They worked well together on stage. And in January of 1933, in a quiet civil ceremony in Erie, Pennsylvania, Leslie Towns Hope married Grace Troxell. He was 30 years old. He was, by this point, calling himself Bob, because Bob Hope sounded better than Leslie Hope for the marquee. He was beginning to make a name in vaudeville. The marriage to Grace Troxell was, almost from the beginning, something he wanted no one to know about. It was kept from the press. It was kept from his professional contacts. It was, to the extent that a legal marriage can be such a thing, secret. Less than a year later, it was over. In the autumn of 1933, Bob Hope walked into a New York club and heard a young woman sing. Her name was Dolores DeFina, performing under the stage name Dolores Reed. She had a low, warm voice and a quality of presence that made Hope a regular at the club for the weeks that followed. He fell for her, and she for him. And in February of 1934, according to the story that Hope and his publicists would tell for the next 70 years, they were married in Erie, Pennsylvania. The problem is that there is no marriage certificate. Richard Zoglin, the journalist and biographer who spent years researching Hope's life for his 2014 book, Hope, Entertainer of the Century, could not find a marriage license for Bob Hope and Dolores Reed anywhere. Not in Erie. Not anywhere in Pennsylvania. Not in New York. The marriage that became the foundation of the wholesome family image that Hope projected for 7 decades. The marriage that would eventually be celebrated as one of the longest in Hollywood history has no documentary evidence. What Zoglin did find was a divorce decree. The divorce of Bob Hope from Grace Troxell dated November 1934, which means that when Hope claimed to have married Dolores in February of 1934, he was still legally married to Grace Troxell. And it also means that even if there had been a ceremony with Dolores in February of 1934, it would have been legally meaningless because he was not yet free to marry anyone else. Hope's publicists, when this information came out in an earlier biography in 1993, denied that the marriage to Grace Troxell had ever happened at all. Zoglin found the marriage certificate in the Erie County Courthouse records. He also found something else. When Grace Troxell's daughter died of a drug overdose in 1998, the person listed on the death record as providing information about the deceased was named as Dolores Hope, with the designation godparent. Dolores Hope, the woman Bob Hope claimed to have married in 1934, was the godmother of the child of the woman he had actually married in 1933. These are the facts. Make of them what you will. What is clear is that by the mid-1930s, Bob Hope had constructed a version of his private life that bore only a passing resemblance to the actual private life he was living. He had a wife, or a woman he called his wife, whom he had installed in a house in California. He had 4 children, all adopted, whom he and Dolores had brought into their home over the years: Linda, Anthony, Nora, and Kelly. And he had a career that was about to become one of the most successful in the history of American entertainment. And he had the affairs. This is where the story becomes both simple and complicated. Simple because the basic facts are not in dispute. Bob Hope had affairs with an enormous number of women throughout his marriage to Dolores. Complicated because the scale and the duration and the specific arrangements that made the whole thing possible are, when you look at them carefully, staggering. The first affairs were in the late 1930s, when Hope's radio show had made him a genuine star, and the power that came with that stardom made him, in the particular culture of Hollywood at the time, essentially untouchable. Sherwood Schwartz, a television writer who worked for Hope in those years, and who later created Gilligan's Island and The Brady Bunch, has described going to a hotel with Hope and finding 3, 4, sometimes 5 young women waiting outside his room, waiting for him to choose which one would come in. This was not an occasional thing, it was a pattern. It was the way things were done. His writers were hired partly to write jokes and partly to keep Dolores from finding out. This is documented. Men who worked for Bob Hope in the 1940s and 1950s have described their duties as including specifically the management of the information that his wife received about his activities on the road. They were his writers and his cover. They traveled with him and reported back to Dolores the version of events that Hope wanted her to have. The affair with Marilyn Maxwell went on for years, long enough and openly enough that the Hollywood community referred to her, routinely and without much surprise, as Mrs. Bob Hope. Maxwell was an actress and singer, beautiful and ambitious, and her relationship with Hope was not a brief encounter, but something sustained and substantial. Dolores knew. People close to both of them have said so. The arrangement, as it eventually became explicit, was this. Hope could do what he did, as long as he did not do it in Dolores's house and did not embarrass her publicly. She was a Catholic woman of strong faith who had made a decision, perhaps early in the marriage, that this was the life she had chosen and that the terms of it were what they were. It was, as one of his biographers put it, a very good marriage, except for the serial infidelity, which is perhaps the most economical summary of a complicated human arrangement ever written. The affairs did not slow down as Hope aged. If anything, they became more brazen. In 1949, he had a relationship with Barbara Payton, a young actress who was ambitious and also volatile, and who was not interested in the discreet arrangement that most of his women had accepted. He set her up in a Hollywood apartment. He visited when he could. When she began to demand more money and more attention than he was prepared to give, he paid her off. She accepted the money and signed an agreement to stay quiet. In 1956, she sold her story to Confidential magazine anyway. She described Hope as a man capable of ruthless vengeance when crossed. She described the apartment and the arrangement and the payoff. She described him not as the warm, patriotic everyman of the radio show and the Christmas specials, but as something colder and harder underneath. Hope's response was perfect in its simplicity. He ignored her. He did not comment. He did not deny. He simply continued being Bob Hope, smiling and joking and performing, and because he was Bob Hope, the story made barely a ripple and sank. The affair with Doris Day happened in 1949 during a charity tour for the March of Dimes. Hope told a friend, years later, that they had had a brief romantic fling. When the tour ended and they returned to Burbank, Dolores was at the airport to meet them. She gave her husband an ostentatious welcome home hug. Doris Day, by Hope's own account, saw the gesture for what it was: a wife marking her territory. She ended whatever was between her and Hope that day at the airport. Rosemary Franklin, who had been crowned Miss World in 1961, was 20 years old when she met Bob Hope. He was 58. Their relationship lasted for years and was, by the accounts of people who knew them, not simply a passing encounter, but something with real feeling in it, at least on his side. He was serious enough about her that his family was aware and concerned. The last affair anyone knows about in detail began when Hope was in his 80s. Her name was Sandy Vinger. She was one of his writers. When the relationship ended, she sued him, claiming that he had promised to support her financially for the rest of her life. The case was settled out of court. He was in his 80s. He had been married to Dolores for 50 years. He was still having affairs with women who worked for him. Now, I want to pause here and say something that the simple telling of these facts can obscure. Dolores Hope was not a victim in the way that word is sometimes used. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and faith who made choices about her own life. She had been told at some point what the terms of the marriage were. She accepted them. She continued to travel with her husband on USO tours to entertain the troops. She raised 4 children. She managed the household. She maintained the Catholic faith that was the center of her private life. She outlived her husband by 8 years, dying in 2011 at the age of 102. By every account of the people who knew her, she was not a woman who appeared broken or defeated. She was, in the particular way of women who have made their peace with a difficult situation and decided to live inside it with dignity, formidable. What she was not was the woman in the image. The image was a partnership, a marriage of equals, a Catholic family with 4 children and a long, beautiful life together. The reality was a man who was somewhere else most of the time, with someone else most of the time, and a woman at home who had agreed, for whatever reasons she held privately, to be the permanent fixture in a life that treated her as a background. The children, by most accounts, did not suffer in the visible way that the children of other famous absent fathers have described. They were not beaten. They were not publicly humiliated. They were simply raised primarily by their mother in a large house in Toluca Lake, while their father was on the road, in the war zone, on the stage, in the hotel room. Bob Hope was a man who performed love better than he practiced it, and the performance was excellent and the practice was inconsistent, and his children appear to have understood this and arrived, as adults, at some version of accommodation with it. His daughter Linda, who became his producer and managed his affairs for 2 decades, has spoken about her father in terms that suggest a complicated affection. Not an uncritical one, but an affection nonetheless. Now let me tell you about the war, because the USO tours are the part of the Bob Hope story that are hardest to look at clearly, because the image of them is so powerful and so positive that it seems almost cruel to examine what was underneath. He did the tours. That is real. From 1941 through 1991, 50 years, 57 tours, Bob Hope flew into war zones to entertain American troops. He went to the Pacific in the Second World War. He went to Korea. He went to Vietnam, year after year after year, through the 1960s and into the 1970s. He went to the Gulf in 1990, when he was 87 years old. He brought comedians and singers and beautiful women in sequined dresses, and he made the men laugh, and the men were grateful, and many of them have said, in the years since, that seeing Bob Hope was one of the things that got them through. All of that is true, and it is significant, and it deserves to be said plainly. What also needs to be said is that the tours served Bob Hope in ways that went beyond the simply patriotic. They kept him in the news in the particular way that performing in front of American troops keeps an entertainer in the news. They were filmed and broadcast as television specials that reached enormous audiences in living rooms across the country. They gave him proximity to presidents and generals and the most powerful people in the American military establishment. A proximity that Bob Hope, who was a man who understood power and liked to be near it, valued greatly. By the time of Vietnam, the tours had become something more complicated still. Hope was not simply entertaining the troops. He was actively and explicitly supporting the government's policy on the war. He was close to Lyndon Johnson. He was closer to Richard Nixon. Nixon actively courted Hope's support for his Vietnam policies, and Hope gave it publicly, from the stage, in front of the men who were being asked to fight the war. The 1969 Christmas show in Vietnam was the moment this became impossible to ignore. When Hope told the soldiers that Nixon had a solid plan for ending the war, the reaction was not laughter. It was not polite silence. It was a sound that Bob Hope had not heard from an audience in 50 years. A sound that is the opposite of what he had spent his whole life producing. They booed him. He has written in his memoir that he understood, in retrospect, that they were not booing him, that they were using the only platform available to them, the presence of a famous man who would be filmed and broadcast to the country, to send a message to the president and the American people about the reality of what was happening in Vietnam. He was generous to them in his retrospective assessment. But the moment happened. The booing happened. And it marked the end of the era in which Bob Hope could stand in front of a crowd of any kind and assume that the laughter would come. He continued to perform. He continued to be funny in the specific and professional way that a man who has been funny for 60 years is always funny. But something had changed. The newer comedians who were rising in the 1970s, the ones who were going to shape comedy for the next generation, had no particular interest in the kind of humor Bob Hope did. George Carlin was talking about language and power. Richard Pryor was talking about race and pain and the specific violence of American life as experienced by those who were not white and wealthy and connected to the president. Lily Tomlin was doing something new with character and voice. Steve Martin was taking the form itself apart and examining its pieces. Bob Hope was still doing the same act he had always done: the format, the setup, and the punchline. The joke about the current president, the joke about his nose, the warm and professional and entirely safe humor that had made him famous in a different era. Christopher Hitchens, in a review published shortly after Hope's death, wrote that Hope had spent a fantastically successful and well-remunerated lifetime demonstrating that a truly unfunny man could make it as a comedian. This is perhaps too harsh. He was funny. He was funny in the specific way of his time and his genre. But by the 1970s and 1980s, his time and his genre had passed him. He kept going anyway, because stopping was not something Bob Hope knew how to do. He had never been a man who was comfortable being still. The childhood in Cleveland, with the absent father and the tight money and the kids calling him hopeless, had produced a man who needed to be in motion, who needed to be on stage, who needed, at some fundamental level, the sound of the room changing when he walked into it. The laughter was not incidental to him. It was not a professional achievement. It was a form of sustenance. He had discovered in childhood that performing was the thing that made the anxiety stop, and he had been performing ever since. And stopping meant the anxiety would return, and he was not going to stop. His staff has described, in the years when Hope was in his 80s and 90s and the natural slowing of age had begun to make the performances more difficult to sustain, a man who was still insisting on working, who still wanted the stage, who still needed the audience, who became difficult in the particular way that people become difficult when the one thing that has held them together for 80 years begins to slip away. He was 100 years old when he died. July 27th, 2003. He had been famous for 70 years. He had entertained more people in more places under more circumstances than any entertainer before him, or likely since. He had 57 USO tours and 10 honorary degrees, and the Congressional Gold Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and an honorary knighthood from the Queen of England. He had been the friend of every president from Franklin Roosevelt to George W. Bush. He died in his bed, which is more than many of the men he had entertained in the war zones could say. He died next to Dolores, which is more than the women he had cycled through over 70 years of marriage might have predicted. He died at 100 years old in Toluca Lake, California, very far from the streets of Cleveland, where a boy called Hopeless had learned to fight and to laugh because fighting and laughing were the only things that worked. I want to say something about what was real in the Bob Hope story, because it is possible, in going through the affairs and the political entanglements and the mysterious marriage and the secret first wife, to lose sight of something that was genuinely there. He made people laugh. This sounds simple. It is not simple. Making people laugh genuinely and consistently and across cultures and continents and decades is one of the hardest things a human being can do. It requires intelligence and timing and a specific understanding of how human anxiety works and where the relief valves are and how to press them at exactly the right moment. Bob Hope had all of that. Not in every era, and not for every audience, and not in the later years when the world had moved past the kind of humor he did. But for 20 years, from the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s, he was probably the funniest man in America. And the men who flew missions over Germany and waded through the Pacific and sat in foxholes in Korea and humped through the jungle in Vietnam knew, when Bob Hope's plane landed, that something was going to happen that would make the next hour feel different from the hours before it. That was real. That mattered. Whatever was behind it, whatever arrangements and infidelities and political calculations and personal needs were underneath the performance was real, and its effect on real people was real. He was also, underneath the performance, a man shaped by specific things that he never spoke about and never fully resolved. The father who drank and was not there. The poverty that produced the vigilance and the need to read the room. The immigrant childhood in which he was an outsider who had to perform his way into acceptance. The first marriage that he buried and denied for 60 years. The dozens of women he moved through in the hotels and the dressing rooms and the apartments he set up for them in Hollywood. The wife at home who agreed to the terms and kept them for 69 years. The children who were raised mostly without him. The political choices that made him, in the 1960s, the enemy of the people he had been the hero of 10 years before. He kept none of this private through effort of character or private virtue. He kept it private through the massive machinery of his celebrity, the publicists and the writers and the handlers and the television specials and the Christmas tours, all of it working in the same direction, all of it producing and sustaining and protecting the image of the warm, patriotic, funny, devoted family man who made America feel good about itself. The image was a performance, like everything else Bob Hope did. It was a very good performance. It ran for 70 years without a major breakdown. Almost no one in the audience ever saw behind it. This is what was behind it. His name was Leslie Towns Hope. He was born in England and raised in poverty in Cleveland, and became the most successful entertainer in America by performing his way out of everything that frightened him, and never stopping and never slowing down, and never, not once in 100 years, letting the room see that the laugh was anything other than genuine. The room never saw, the image held. He died at 100, and the tributes were enormous, and the image held even then, even in the eulogies, even in the retrospectives that ran on every television channel for a week after his death. Dolores buried him in the family plot at San Fernando Mission Cemetery. She outlived him by 8 years. She did not give many interviews in those years. She was, by every account, not a woman who needed to explain herself. She knew what she knew. She had always known what she knew. Good night. There is one more thread I want to pull, because it connects the personal and the public in a way that the simple telling of the affairs and the marriages does not quite reach. Bob Hope was a man who built his career on the premise that America was essentially good, and that the role of comedy was to make people feel better about themselves and their country. This was not a cynical calculation. He believed it. He was a patriot in the old-fashioned and genuine sense, a man who had come from England as a child and had been given something by America that England had not been able to give him. which was the possibility of being someone different from the person he was born as. He had been Leslie Hopeless in Cleveland, and he had become Bob Hope in Hollywood, and the distance between those two identities was the distance that only America, in his understanding of it, could provide. This belief was real, and it shaped everything he did in the public sphere, including the tours and the relationship with the presidents and the hawkish position on Vietnam. He was not performing patriotism. He felt it. What he was doing was conflating his love of what America had given him with an uncritical support of what America was doing at any given moment, which is a confusion that many people make and that tends to go unnoticed until the moment it becomes visible. In 1969, it became visible. The men in the jungle had not asked to be there. They had been drafted, most of them, or had enlisted because the alternatives were worse. They were not experiencing the America that Bob Hope had experienced. The America that opened its doors to a clever boy from Cleveland and turned him into the most famous entertainer on the planet. They were experiencing a different America, the one that sent them to die in a country whose politics they did not understand for reasons that were becoming harder and harder to defend. And when Bob Hope stood up and told them that Nixon had a plan, they booed because they knew better than Bob Hope what Nixon's plan looked like from the receiving end. He was, in that moment, the wrong man on the wrong stage, saying the wrong thing. Not because he was dishonest, because he had always been, at the deepest level, an entertainer, and entertainers tell audiences what they want to hear. And he had made the mistake of assuming that what this particular audience wanted to hear was the same as what every other audience had always wanted to hear. It was not. He spent the years after Vietnam trying to understand what had happened to the relationship between himself and the American people, or at least the younger half of it. He was baffled, genuinely, by the counterculture's rejection of him. He did not understand why being patriotic and successful and funny in the way that he was funny had become, for an entire generation, evidence of something suspect. He made jokes about hippies and protesters in the way that a man of his era made jokes about what he did not understand, which is to say not very well, and the jokes landed badly, and the laughter that had always been reliable became, in certain rooms, something more complicated and conditional. He adapted, slowly and imperfectly, but he adapted. By the 1980s, he had learned to be less explicitly political in his performances. He had learned to acknowledge, with the particular grace of a very old man who has been in the business long enough to know what the business requires, that the world had changed and that he was going to have to change with it if he wanted to remain in it. He remained in it for 2 more decades. He performed into his 90s. He made appearances, gave interviews, showed up in the way that famous, very old people show up at the events that require their presence. He was not the performer he had been at his peak, but he was still recognizably Bob Hope, still doing the setup and the punchline, still looking for the laugh, still needing it. He needed it to the end. That is perhaps the most consistent thing about him across the 100 years of his life. The need for the room to change when he entered it, the need for the laugh. The boy in Cleveland who had been called hopeless and had discovered that making people laugh was the only reliable way to make the room a safer place than it was, that boy never left. He was in every performance, every Christmas tour, every night in every hotel room with every woman who was not Dolores. He was in the laugh itself, which was always the same laugh, the warm, professional, reliable laugh that said everything was going to be fine. Everything was not always fine, but the laugh never said so. Now I want to talk about Dolores because in every telling of the Bob Hope story, she is the supporting character, the woman who stayed, the good Catholic wife who endured. And she deserves more than that. Dolores Defina was born in 1909 in Manhattan. She was a singer and performer of real talent who gave up her career when she married Bob Hope. Not because she had no talent, but because that was the bargain, that was the understanding. That was what the wives of famous men did in 1934. She raised 4 children, essentially alone. She managed the house and the social obligations and the public appearances that required a wife's presence. She accompanied her husband on USO tours, including to Vietnam and to Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, where in 1990 she was the only female entertainer permitted to perform. She was 81 years old. She was also a woman of genuine faith. The Catholicism was not a performance or a social habit. It was the center of her interior life, the thing that gave structure to the long years of a marriage that required her to know certain things and not speak of them. The faith that allowed her to live with the terms of the arrangement without, apparently, being destroyed by them. In her later years, after Bob's death, she was asked occasionally about the marriage. Her answers were careful and limited. She said she had loved him. She said it had been a good life. She said she had no regrets. These are the kinds of answers that people give when they have decided what they are going to say and are not going to say anything else. And they do not tell you much about what was actually inside the decision. What she did in 1933 and 1934, when she was a young singer in New York who fell in love with a man who was already married to someone else, and who may have offered her a marriage that was not legally possible, we do not know. Whether she knew about Grace Troxell then, whether she found out later, whether the information was kept from her and came to her in stages over the years, we do not know. What we know is that she stayed. For 69 years, she stayed. Through the affairs and the absences and the Christmas tours that kept him away from his family for most of December every year for 50 years, and through the political controversies and the career decline, and the years when the world had moved past him and he was still trying to catch up, she stayed because she had decided to stay, and she was a woman who honored her decisions. She died in 2011 at the age of 102. She is buried next to her husband at the San Fernando Mission Cemetery in Mission Hills, California. She outlived him by 8 years. She outlived the first marriage he never acknowledged, and the affairs he spent his career concealing, and the biographies that eventually told the parts of the story he had worked so hard to keep quiet. She outlived all of it, and she did not comment on any of it publicly. That is, in its own way, a kind of performance as disciplined as anything her husband ever did on a stage. I want to end by going back to the beginning, to Eltham, England, in 1903. To a stonemason's house where the 5th of 7 boys is learning to mimic the people around him, because mimicry is the first tool a clever child finds for managing the anxiety of a household that is not entirely safe. The father drinks, the money is uncertain, the mother sings, and the boy hears in her singing. Something that the performing can do, the way a voice in a room can change what the room feels like. He carried that knowledge across the Atlantic and through Ellis Island and into the streets of Cleveland and up through vaudeville and onto the radio and into the movies and across the Pacific and over Korea and into Vietnam, and he used it every time, in every room for 100 years. He found the laugh and he gave it to the room, and the room changed, and the anxiety that had been there before, the specific anxiety of a boy who had grown up with not quite enough and who had been called hopeless by the kids on the street, was gone for the duration. The duration was 100 years, and what was behind it was a first marriage he denied, and a second marriage he may not have legally completed, and 60 years of affairs with women whose names most of the world will never know, and a wife who stayed through all of it, and a father who drank and disappeared, and a childhood in Cleveland that left its mark in the specific, relentless way that childhoods always leave their marks, shaping the adult's needs in ways that the adult can perform over, but never quite resolve. He performed over it for 100 years. The performance was magnificent. The reality was human, complicated and flawed, and sometimes unkind, and sometimes genuinely generous, in the specific way of people who are capable of great things in public and more ordinary things in private, which is to say, in the way of most of us, only at a scale that the rest of us do not have to manage. His name was Leslie Towns Hope. He was born in England and raised in poverty and became Bob Hope and made the world laugh and died in his bed at 100, surrounded by the family that had stayed. The laughter was real. The rest was also real. Both things are true. Good night. There is a detail about Grace Troxell that I keep returning to because it is small and it is specific, and small, specific details are usually the most honest ones. When Hope's publicists denied the marriage to Grace Troxell in 1993, when they said the marriage license meant nothing and the ceremony never happened and the whole thing was a misunderstanding, Grace Troxell had been dead for 17 years. She had died in 1976 in Las Vegas, at the age of 65, without ever making a public statement about her marriage to Bob Hope. Not once. Not to the press, not in an interview, not in a memoir, not in any documented conversation that anyone has been able to find. She kept the secret her entire life. Whether she kept it because she had been paid to keep it, or because she had been asked to keep it by a man she had once loved, or because she had arrived at some private understanding about what the keeping of it was worth to her, we do not know. What we know is that she kept it. She lived 40 years after the divorce, 40 years in which Bob Hope became the most famous entertainer in America and celebrated 50-year anniversaries with Dolores and received the Congressional Gold Medal and was friends with every president. And Grace Troxell, who had been his wife, said nothing. Hope, for his part, quietly sent her money in the years before her death. This is documented. He did not acknowledge her publicly. He did not mention her in interviews. He did not include her in any account of his life that he gave to anyone. But he sent her money. And that is the kind of gesture that tells you something about a person that the public performance does not. He knew what he owed. He did not know how to say it out loud. He paid it in private, in the way that men pay debts they cannot acknowledge publicly, quietly, without fanfare, in envelopes that arrived at an address in Las Vegas and that no one in Hollywood was supposed to know about. He was very good at things no one was supposed to know about. The other detail I want to give you is about the end of his life. In the years when the dementia had taken enough of him that the performance was no longer something he could sustain. The Bob Hope, who had always known how to work a room, who had always been the fastest person in it to read where the laugh was and find it, who had been performing continuously for 70 years without a significant gap, discovered in his late 90s that the instrument was going. His staff and his family have described those years carefully and with evident love. He was still himself, in the ways that people are still themselves even when the larger machinery of the mind is beginning to fail. He still laughed. He still made jokes, sometimes the right jokes in the right moment, sometimes jokes that did not quite land because the moment had passed before the punchline arrived. He still wanted the room to respond. He still needed the room to respond. He was 100 years old and the room was smaller now, just family, just the people in the house. In Toluca Lake, and he was still looking for the laugh. He died on July 27, 2003, in that house, in his bed, 5 weeks after his 100th birthday. The tributes were everything you would expect. The flags at the United States Capitol were lowered. Every living president issued a statement. The military honored him for the 57 USO tours in ways that brought people to tears. The biographies that came later, including Zoglin's exhaustive 2014 account, told the other story. The first wife, the affairs, the arrangement with Dolores, the booing in Vietnam, the political entanglements, the complicated human being underneath the performance. Both stories are true. That is always the answer. When you look closely enough at a person who has been famous long enough for people to have decided who they are. Both stories are true, and neither one cancels the other, and the full picture is somewhere in the middle, somewhere between the man on the stage with the grin and the man in the hotel room with women. His wife was not supposed to know about, and the man quietly sending money to a woman he had married in secret and denied for 40 years. He was all of those men. He was also the man who made the soldiers laugh in the jungle, which is not a small thing. He was also the boy in Cleveland called Hopeless, who discovered that a room full of people laughing is a safer room than a room full of people not laughing, and who spent 100 years making rooms safer. That is not nothing. It is not the whole story either. Now you know more of it. His name was Leslie Towns Hope. He was born in England and raised in Cleveland and became the funniest man in America and died at 100 in his bed in California, surrounded by the family that had stayed, next to a woman who had known more than anyone and said less than anyone and outlived him by 8 years. He made people laugh. That part was real. Take care of yourself tonight. And if someone tells you a joke, laugh. Even if you know what is behind it, sometimes the laugh is the whole point. Good night. One more thing, and then I will let you go. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America was officially at war, Bob Hope did his first military show. It was at March Field in California, a few hundred soldiers on a Sunday afternoon. And it was not a grand production. It was a comedian with some jokes and a microphone, doing what he did, finding the laugh. He has described that afternoon in several interviews over the years, and the description is always similar. The soldiers laughed, and he felt something that he had not felt in any theater or radio studio or movie set. He felt useful in a way that the applause of a civilian audience did not produce. The soldiers' laughter was different from the laughter of people at a comedy show. It carried more weight. It came from a place of greater need. These were men who were about to be asked to do things that the civilians in the theaters were not going to be asked to do. And their laughter was the laughter of people who are finding relief where they can find it and who are grateful for the finding. He spent the next 50 years chasing that feeling. This is what gets lost when the Bob Hope story is told only as a story of a man using patriotism as a brand, or of a man with political connections who parlayed them into television specials. He was also a man who had discovered, in March of 1941 at a small airbase in California on a Sunday afternoon, that there was something his particular gift could do for people in need that it could not do for people in comfort. And he went back to that discovery again and again for 50 years, to war zones and jungle bases and hospital wards and everywhere else that men were being asked to pay a price that most of the country was not paying. He went back because the laughter that came from those places was the most real laughter he knew. Not the laughter of an audience at a show, the laughter of men who need it. That was real too. I want you to know that it was real too. His name was Bob Hope. He was born in England in 1903. He died in California in 2003. In between, he made more people laugh in more places under more difficult circumstances than anyone before him or since. What was behind it was complicated and human and imperfect, and sometimes unkind, and sometimes quietly generous. What was in front of it was the laugh. The laugh was real. Good night. Before I close tonight, I want to return to 1969 because that night in Vietnam deserves more than the brief mention I gave it earlier. The show was at a base called Lai Khe, about 50 miles north of Saigon. It was December. The jungle was hot and the war was going badly, and the men at Lai Khe were not men who had volunteered enthusiastically for a conflict they believed in. Many of them had been drafted. Many of them had come from the parts of America that did not send their children to college to avoid the draft. Many of them were young, very young, the age of the boys in the college towns who were burning their draft cards and marching with signs, except that these boys had not had the options that the ones with the signs had had. They had been looking forward to the show. Bob Hope was still Bob Hope in 1969. The name still meant something. The man who had come to the jungle to make you laugh for a few hours while the war waited outside was a real gift, and the men at Lai Khe were ready to receive it. And then Hope said what Nixon had told him to say, and the booing started. It spread through the crowd the way laughter spreads, except it was not laughter. It was the sound of men who felt that they were being used for something other than what they had thought they were gathered for. They had come to laugh, and instead they were being told by a famous man who was safe and who would go home to California after the show that the president had a plan. They knew what the plan looked like from where they were standing. Hope, to his credit, did not shut the show down. He kept performing. He moved past the moment and found the jokes, and the laughter came back, partially, unevenly. Not what it had been before the moment, but not nothing either. He finished the show. He went home. He thought about it for a long time. In later years, he said he had made a mistake. Not in going to Vietnam, not in supporting the troops, in conflating the support of the troops with the support of the policy that had put them there. He had always thought of those two things as the same thing, and in 1969 in the jungle at Lai Khe, the men who were living the difference between them had told him, with the only voice they had in that moment, that they were not the same thing at all. He was 66 years old. He had been performing for 50 years. And the thing he understood about audiences, the thing he had understood since he was a boy in Cleveland making the room change, was this. The room always tells you the truth. You can ignore it. You can perform over it. But the room always tells you the truth. And the room at Lai Khe in December of 1969 was telling him something he had not wanted to hear. He heard it. He did not say so publicly for a long time. But he heard it. That is the other side of Bob Hope that the image obscures. Not the affairs and the absent father and the secret wife. The man who could hear what a room was telling him, even when the room was telling him something he did not want to hear. Who could absorb the information and carry it and eventually, slowly, adjust? He was not a stupid man. He was not an inflexible man. He was a man who had spent 100 years reading rooms and who had learned, over those 100 years, that the room is always right. The room at Lai Khe was right. He spent the rest of his life, quietly and without making a ceremony of it, understanding why. His name was Bob Hope. He was born Leslie Towns Hopeless in England and became Bob Hope in America and made the world laugh for 70 years and died at 100, having been many things, not all of them comfortable to look at, and having left behind something real. The laugh was real. The men in the jungle laughed when he gave them something worth laughing at. That was enough to keep going back for 50 years. That was enough. Good night.